Among their pampas and mountains, in addition to football and tango, Argentinians are known for being a people of fiery political passions. Dancing between stages of prosperity and others of violent struggles, the southern nation would see its last military government come to power in 1976, led by a reserved, disciplined, and cold man. Jorge Rafael Videla was the main figure of the so-called process of national reorganization, a controversial stage that still resonates in the Argentine collective imagination. Pacification and fierce anti-communist struggle, inflationary economic chaos, corruption scandals in the '78 World Cup, and the patriotic war of the Falklands are just some of the milestones that mark the period of the military government junta. Today we are going to learn about the life of its main representative. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to leave your comments, to share the material, to activate and support on our Patreon, which you can get below to continue bringing you exclusive and quality videos. Jorge Rafael Videla was born on August 2nd, 1925 in the city of Mercedes, in the province of Buenos Aires, Argentina. He was the third child of Colonel Rafael Eugenio Videla Bengolia and Maria Olga Redondo Ojea. The Videla family came from a traditional political lineage with notable antecedents in the province of San Luis, where his great-great-grandfather, through his grandfather Jacinto Videla, was governor of San Luis between the year 1891 and 1893. Videla entered the National Military College in 1942 and graduated in December 1944 with the rank of Infantry Second Lieutenant. He ranked 6th out of 196 cadets in his class. In April 1948, at the age of 22, he married what appears to have been his only girlfriend in his life, Alicia Raquel Hartrich Lacoste, daughter of the ambassador Samuel Alejandro Hartrich. Together, they had 7 children, 2 of whom followed a military career in the Argentine army. Since gaining independence, Argentina has gone through times of war and coups, as well as periods of significant stability and prosperity. While Videla was beginning his military studies, a military coup occurred in 1943 that would pave the way for the subsequent rise to power of Juan Domingo Perón in 1946, who inaugurated a government with a third-position nationalist focus that rejected both communist Marxism and liberal capitalism. During the 2 presidential terms of Perón, Videla continued his training at the Superior War School between the years 1952 and 1954, obtaining the title of staff officer. In 1955, Perón is overthrown by a coup d'etat by various sectors of the Argentine population. Thus began for Argentina a new, even more tumultuous period, which would oscillate between democratic elections and new coup d'etat. Perón goes into exile, Peronism is officially banned and becomes a sort of clandestine resistance, while the endless struggle between conservatives, right-wingers, liberals, socialists, social democrats, progressives, and very diverse groups of the country continues to unfold. In addition to coming from a family of lineage to rise rapidly in the military and political establishment, he was occupying to rise rapidly in the military and political establishment. He held various positions such as the Secretary of Defense between 1958 and 1960 and the direction of the military academy until 1962. With the overthrow of Perón, the Peronist organizations begin to mutate, ranging from the most nationalist and conservative factions to the most socialist and Marxist factions. Some radicalize to the left and begin to venture into armed struggle from 1960 to continue evolving into authentic guerrilla groups. Similarly, in the military sector, anti-Peronist leaderships had become preeminent and begin to divide into 2 factions. A more politicized faction that considered Peronism to be as serious a threat as communism that had to be fought militarily, and another faction that also opposed Peronism, but that rescued its national and Christian sense. After a resurgence of Peronism in the legislative elections, in 1966 a new military coup occurs, self-styled Argentine Revolution, and supported by various anti-Peronist sectors of the country. This coup establishes a conservative military regime and anti-communist. During this military regime, between August 4th and September 7th of 1970, Videla was appointed military governor of the province of Tucumán, and by the end of 1973, he was appointed chief of the General Staff of the Army. Videla was a reserved man with a melancholic expression. Ernesto Sabato described him as a cultured, intelligent, simple man with broad judgment. He was a devout man of Catholic monastic traditions in the style of Francisco Franco, and many considered him a good family man. He was not a man of many friends and did not like to move in groups. He was always seen as a very professional, disciplined, discreet man, and before leading his coup d'etat, United States intelligence described him as a moderate and constitutionalist incapable of overthrowing the government. The new military regime that was installed in the year 1972, after the pressure of many in 1972, after the pressure from numerous social and political sectors, they are forced to call for free elections, with freedom also for the participation of Peronism, but maintaining the prohibition of Juan Perón participating as president. The Peronist candidate Campera is elected, and now Perón's return to Argentina is enabled, who wins new presidential elections that are called for 1973. But the internal and external tensions were complex. Perón dies in 1974 while there was a left-wing Peronism, and his vice president and wife, now widow, Maria Estela de Perón, also known as Isabel Perón, to the presidency. The death of Juan Perón and the arrival of Isabelita to the presidency open a phase of fragility in the authority of the state. For years, various irregular organizations had emerged in Argentina. Left and right-wing armed groups, from the Montoneros and the People's Revolutionary Army to the famous Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, an anti-communist paramilitary group created by one of Perón's ministers in 1973. The situation also begins to worsen after the death of Perón. It also begins to worsen after the death of Perón in the population. Likewise in 1975 in the population. Likewise in 1975, after 11 years of relative stability and economic growth, the government of Isabel Perón executes an economic adjustment plan known as the Rodrigazo, with several economic shock measures that produce discontent in the population, which among its short-term results had an increase in inflation from 20% in 1974 to 160% in 1975. In Argentina, it was a cauldron of groups and political interests that began to publicly call for the resignation of the president and even publicly demand the intervention of the military, and other political groups begin to conspire against Isabel Perón, and other political groups begin to conspire against Isabel Perón. While she is losing support and seeks to maneuver to advance the president to resign, she answers, "See, doctor, I do not resign even if they shoot me, because resigning here would validate what is going to come after." To this picture must be added that Argentina was the only country in the Southern Cone that was experimenting with a government of democratic alternation, while in Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia, military regimes were governing. Amid political turmoil, Videla continues to gain prominence in the military establishment. In 1975, Isabel Perón appoints Videla as nothing less than the general commander of the army, under the recommendation that Videla was an apolitical professional man who would never lead a coup d'etat. However, all the conspiratorial eyes were already pointing at him, and there were numerous clandestine meetings being held. Furthermore, Henry Kissinger and other powerful American figures were developing a political and military strategy for the United States. This would formally translate in 1975 into the so-called Condor Plan. Hand-in-hand with the heads of intelligence services and the regimes of Chile, Paraguay, Argentina, Bolivia, and Uruguay, a space for mutual support, information exchange, and coordination and advice was created in order to combat on all possible fronts the movements that were not aligned with the objectives of the North American power, mainly leftist groups, but also nationalists and others, considered fundamentally as subversive movements. Peronism, which was always uncomfortable for the United States, and the armed groups that emerged from the Peronist route were, of course, on this list of undesirable bodies for the Anglo-Saxon power. With all circumstances aligned and with the support of the United States, on March 24, 1976, Videla, as a representative of the army, leads a coup d'etat along with Emilio Eduardo Machera, representative of the Navy, and Orlando Ramon Agosti, representative of the aviation. A situation of war is assumed against the armed subversive groups that threatened public peace. A policy of holy war against atheist Marxism is even proclaimed. Thus, a war council is installed and the so-called process of national reorganization is proclaimed. Of war and proclaims the so-called process of national reorganization. Videla assumes the Argentine presidency 5 days later. Argentina. The process of national reorganization that would last from 1976 to 1983 initiated a civic military regime that conceived that the Argentine conflict situation demanded a strong authority state that guaranteed the stability of the nation and gradually led it to democracy. The declared objectives of the national reorganization process were to combat corruption, demagoguery, and subversion, and to position Argentina in the so-called Western and Christian world. Upon coming to power, the junta approves a statute with a higher status than the Constitution and reserves for itself the executive and legislative power. At the same time as they dissolve Congress, they replace members of the Supreme Court and suspend the activities of political parties. Of the Argentine population, as well as a good part of the business sector and the Catholic Church. Likewise, the United States was the key main support, both diplomatically, but also in terms of financing and police advice for Videla and the military junta, a country with which ties were strengthened during the process of national reorganization. Israel was also important in the sale of weapons to the Argentine regime and in advising the soft services of the military regime. That is, it was among those who were in favor of a prompt democratic opening. During the process of national reorganization, it has been reported that between 9,000 dissidents were disappeared, victims of cruel treatment, or their lives were directly ended through the so-called task groups or gangs that responded to the junta. The official argument for this political repression was the fight against movements and organizations considered subversive and communist, also in the context of the Cold War and the growing conflict and violence that was experienced in Argentine politics, in addition to the widespread threat of an armed revolution from the left that was looming around the world. And indeed, during the years of national reorganization, the growing armed violence and the struggle between factions were appeased and minimized, and organizations like Montoneros were basically dissolved after the Videla government. For some, this was the price to lead the country back to democratic peace. At the same time, the cases of child appropriation by the regime from parents who were victims of the military police to then be given up for adoption to military personnel or civilians linked to the armed forces were heavily condemned afterwards. Videla defended himself in court by claiming that the children who had been adopted were the children of militant guerrilla women who had allegedly used them as human shields in battles against the government. The regime also maintained strong surveillance and direct or indirect control of the main media outlets, just as it sought to purge education. In 1977, he declares, "In every war there are people who survive, others who are incapacitated, others who die, and others who disappear. Argentina is ending this war, and consequently it must be prepared to face its consequences." End quote. At the same time, General Manuel Bayón also commented that year, "In our days, the worst that could happen has been consummated, and of the most disastrous consequences, the infiltration of Marxist ideologies in the national sense, and even more so in Argentine nationalism and in the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church." Beyond the political stabilization that the junta achieves in the economic field, the majority of Argentines have bad memories of this period, and we will see the numbers that explain it. Videla and his team, led by the Minister of Economy José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz, implemented policies called free market or economic liberalization of exchange rate, financial deregulation, tariff reduction and exchange rate, financial deregulation, tariff reduction, and privatizations. These policies enabled more capital to flow into commerce. Meanwhile, they brought negative consequences for the national industry, commerce. Which suffered a severe deterioration and numerous factory closures. Poverty in Buenos Aires, which from the 40s in 1974 was 5.8%, rose to 13% in 1980 and to an unprecedented 34% in 1982 when the military junta was still in power. Inflation of over 100% was also a constant during the government of Videla and the subsequent presidents of the junta. On the other hand, Argentina's external debt level increased from $7,800 million in 1975 to $45,000 million at the end of 1983. Videla and the junta took several economic measures that led to this situation. In 1977, the Financial Entities Law was enacted, marking a significant reform in the Argentine financial system. This law stipulated that the state should stop financing itself through loans from the central bank and start doing so through internal and external credits. In 1978, the Minister of Economy implemented a system of scheduled currency devaluation known as the tablita. This was done in an attempt to control the strong demand for foreign currency and bring greater exchange order in an inflationary context that was eating away at savers' money. This measure, along with the previously mentioned law on financial entities, promoted strong financial speculation and high interest rates. These measures had various costs. More than 25 credit entities closed and the state had to assume their debts. The liberalization of the credit market also meant that mortgage loans came to have an annual interest rate of 100%, which proved unpayable for many debtors and led to a significant number of people losing ownership of their homes. By 1978, the annual inflation reached 160%, and the gross domestic product experienced a drop of 3.2% during that year. The following year, the inflation rate reaches 139 percentage points and the economy continues to stagnate. In addition, there was a 25% flight of bank deposits and the four most important banks in the system went bankrupt. During Martínez de Hoz's administration, the Argentine foreign debt, as we mentioned, goes from $7 billion to more than $40 billion. By 1980, exports had fallen 20% compared to the previous year, while imports had increased by 30%. In this scenario, the banking crisis of 1980 occurs, which ended the stage known as sweet money. The bankruptcy of the regional exchange bank, along with the closure of 37 other financial entities, impacted industrial sectors and led to a strong bank run and currency flight. In geopolitics, the 1978 crisis between Argentina and Chile was a conflict that happened in 1978. As a precursor to this, in 1971, the presidents of both countries had agreed to submit the dispute over the islands south of the Beagle Channel to an arbitration tribunal composed of judges agreed upon by both governments. The arbitration award, announced in May of 1977, grants Chile the Picton, Nueva, and Lennox Islands, along with the adjacent islands, while Argentina obtains the northern half of the channel and the corresponding islands. However, the Argentine military government junta declares the sentence as irreparably null and began planning a war of aggression against Chile with the aim of reversing the award. On the night of the 21st to the 22nd of December in 1978, but it was aborted hours later when the junta accepted the Pope's mediation in the conflict. The conflict would not be resolved until after the military junta was dissolved, when in 1984 President Raúl Alfonsín, elected by votes from 1983, recognizes what was agreed through the mediation of Pope John Paul II and ends the conflict. In 1978, there was also a change in the members of the Argentine military government junta. However, Videla is ratified as president of the government, which demonstrates his leadership. A strong campaign against Videla's regime was unfolding around the world, to which Videla responded with a massive international campaign that had the slogan, "We Argentinians are right and human." At the end of the stipulated 5-year presidential term, amidst Videla's inability to stabilize the country economically, with 3-digit inflation, increasing unemployment, and depreciation of the armed forces, the military junta decides in 1981 to dismiss Videla as president of the nation and instead appoints General Roberto Viola. Videla would take a backseat publicly, although his opinion would continue to carry weight in power circles. The new president, Viola, appoints Lorenzo Sigot as Minister of Economy, a moderate. The new minister abolishes the scheduled moderate evaluation system. The new minister eliminates the scheduled evaluation system of the previous minister and establishes a dual exchange system with a so-called free financial dollar and a so-called state-regulated commercial dollar. But beyond his measures, under this new administration, the foreign debt increases even more by 31%, and Argentina would experience the worst recession in its history since 1930, when it was 81% in 1981 and another 9% in 1982. This produced a new rearrangement of forces that led the military junta to appoint a new one in 81. Under Galtieri's government, it was applied in 81. Under Galtieri's government, what some call an adjustment or austerity program was applied. Public spending is restricted, monetary circulation is reduced, wages are frozen, and significant state assets are sold to private companies. However, amidst the political and economic debacle of the military junta, the event that came to mark Galtieri's government and Hispanic American history was Argentina's sovereign claim over the Falkland Islands, when the military junta decided to launch a military reconquest operation in April of 1982, which triggered an undeclared war between Great Britain and Argentina lasting over 72 days, with over 200 casualties on the British side and over 600 casualties on the Argentine side. Although the Argentine troops surprised the world with their performance and bravery against the British Empire, the conflict ended with Argentina's surrender on June 14th. This seemed to be the final blow to the military government junta. After the defeat and the economic crisis, President Leopoldo Galtieri resigns, and the junta names Reinaldo Vignoni as the new president. Vignone appoints José Danilo Pastore as Minister of Economy, who declares a state of emergency to deal with factory closures, high inflation, which exceeded 200% in 1982, and the constant devaluation of the currency. But in less than 2 months, Pastores was replaced by another minister, Jorge, who resumed a policy of greater state regulation, such as the establishment of a price control on the products of 675 companies. Similarly, the central bank announces the nationalization of the debt of large private companies. The real wage, which had risen considerably between 1970 and 1975, did nothing but continue to lose value until the last days of the junta. Once the military junta was displaced and democracy arrived, inflation would continue to worsen until 91, reaching unprecedented peaks in Argentine history. According to the judge's ruling in the case of Martinez de Hoz and others, the exponential increase in debt that Argentina experienced during those years was essentially the result of a fraudulent scheme of scamming the nation carried out by national and foreign companies, military and economic agents that allowed the diversion of substantial public funds into private hands. During the period of the process of national reorganization, numerous cases of corruption involving the military government were also reported. One of the most notorious was related to the autonomous entity World 78, created in 1976 to organize the World Cup of 1978 in Argentina. The World Cup's management was secretive. The actual cost of the World Cup far exceeded the declared budget, and all kinds of misappropriation of funds were reported. Regardless, Argentina celebrated in a big way for becoming the world champion. Inside and outside the junta, there were numerous sectors calling for a return to a democratic alternation system, its image greatly weakened by violence and economic chaos, plus the defeat in the Falklands, and considered by some that the objective of political stabilization and subjugation of subversive groups had already been achieved. The junta was forced to cede power and call for free elections. Peronism suffers its first presidential electoral defeat in these elections against the candidate of the Radical Party, Raúl Alfonsín. Alfonsín takes office on December 10, 1983, inaugurating a new period of democratic alternation that persists to this day. After the inauguration of President Raúl Alfonsín in 1983, the National Commission is created to investigate the acts committed during the National Reorganization. This commission presented its report known as Never Again in 1984. Trials were carried out in the so-called Trial of the Juntas, condemning its members. Videla and the generals who led the junta did not flee into exile, but presented themselves to defend in front of courts. In 1975, Jorge Rafael Videla is declared guilty for the death and disappearance of thousands of citizens. He is sentenced to life imprisonment and to the removal of his military rank. After 5 years in prison, he is released following a pardon from President Carlos Menem. However, he returns to house arrest 3 years later because one of his crimes was classified as imprescriptible. In 2008, by order of a judge, he loses the benefit of house arrest and is transferred to the Campo de Mayo prison. There he would live in a common, small and simple room. He would spend his last years with a crucifix above his bed, praying the rosary regularly and taking communion every Sunday. He never evaded the responsibility of the board's actions, which he always reasoned as a necessary evil for the greater mission of rescuing the Republic from anarchy and communism. Finally, in 2013, Jorge Rafael Videla dies from a cardiorespiratory arrest, followed by many demonstrations of repudiation to his name and other expressions of deep respect and admiration. His burial generated repudiation in his hometown, and he was secretly buried in a cemetery in Pilar without receiving military honors. The process of national reorganization erupted after a long stage of coup, counter-coups, and guerrillas in the Argentine nation. He assumed the national situation as one of war and acted accordingly. For some, a period of excessive terror, and for others, a necessary regime to put order and redirect the country towards a stable democracy. The wounds of the losing side and the innocents are still heard in the complaints that persist to this day, although Videla never wavered in continuing to defend the actions of the board. Along with violence and political pacification, which paradoxically often go hand in hand, the economic debacle and corruption scandals mark the memory of this regime that was the last of the military governments of Argentina.